The crossroads lay where two dust-choked trails cut through the wide-open prairie, marked only by a crooked signpost and the memory of wagons that had passed through before. Once every month, the place came alive. Traders arrived from every direction, farmers with sacks of grain, hunters with bundled pelts, wanderers carrying little more than stories. There was no sheriff, no town council, only the quiet agreement that business here stayed civil. Most of the time, Daniel arrived just before midday, as he always did. He reined in his horse near the edge of the market and scanned the gathering with practiced caution. His movements were calm, deliberate, shaped by years of watching trouble before it found him. A weathered satchel hung at his side, filled with tools and small goods he traded for supplies. But that wasn't what brought him here, month after month. He tied his horse to a fence post, worn smooth by other hands, and tipped his hat low, shielding his face from the harsh sun. He didn't search long. Near a stall, selling dried herbs and candles made of tallow, Clara stood, speaking with an older woman. Her posture was straight, but unassuming, her voice low enough not to invite attention. She wore a simple blue dress, faded by time and travel, her dark hair braided neatly down her back. To anyone else, she was just another trader passing through. To Daniel, she was the reason the crossroads mattered. They noticed each other at nearly the same moment, as they always did. Clara excused herself from the stall and walked toward him, her steps steady, her expression guarded but warm in a way she never showed anyone else. Daniel felt the familiar easing in his chest, a quiet relief he never admitted out loud. "You're cutting it close," Clara said, stopping beside an empty wagon. "Sun's still high," Daniel replied. "That means I'm on time." She smiled faintly, just enough to soften her eyes. "You always say that." They had been meeting like this for almost a year. 12 quiet exchanges in the same patch of dust, never speaking names, never asking questions that might reach too far. It had started as a half-joking rule on their first meeting. No names, no histories, just words shared in the present. Somehow, the rule had stuck, becoming something sacred. They spoke of small things at first-road conditions, rumors of storms, prices rising in distant towns. Daniel handed her a bundle of fine nails he'd made himself. Clara passed him a cloth-wrapped loaf of bread, still faintly warm. "You bake now?" he asked. "Only when I can," she said. "It keeps me moving." Daniel nodded. He understood that kind of answer. They both lived between places, never rooted long enough for comfort to turn into danger. For a while, they stood in silence, listening to the sounds of the market. Horses snorted, a fiddle played somewhere near the center, and laughter drifted through the air. The crossroads always felt like borrowed time, a pause in lives that otherwise refused to slow. "I thought about telling you once," Clara said suddenly. Daniel looked at her. "Telling me what?" She hesitated, fingers tightening around the strap of her satchel. "Everything." His heart thudded harder than he liked. "And you didn't?" "No," she said softly. "Because some things are safer, unnamed." Daniel didn't argue. He had secrets of his own things, better left buried under dust and distance. Still, he wondered what it would feel like to hear her speak her name aloud, to know the shape of her past. The mood shifted without warning. A hush rippled through the market, subtle but unmistakable. Conversations dropped. The fiddle went silent. Daniel's eyes lifted, scanning instinctively. 3 men were pushing through the crowd, their coats long, their hands too close to their weapons. They didn't look like traders. They looked like men who followed trouble for a living. Clara sensed it too. "Daniel," she whispered, using his name by accident or instinct for the first time. The sound of it struck him harder than any blow. He stepped slightly in front of her, his body a quiet shield. "Stay close," he murmured. The men stopped a few paces away, their leader's gaze sweeping over them with lazy confidence. He smiled, thin and knowing. "Well," the man said, "ain't this a lucky meeting?" At the crossroads, where names were never shared, danger had finally arrived and it wasn't interested in rules. The leader's smile lingered as his men spread out, cutting off the narrow paths between wagons. Daniel's hand drifted closer to his coat, where a knife rested against his ribs. He didn't draw it, not yet. Drawing first often meant dying first. Around them, traders pretended not to notice, eyes fixed on goods or horses, each person silently deciding how much risk another life was worth. Clara felt her pulse quicken, but kept her chin high. Fear, she had learned, was best kept private. "You folks look lost," Daniel said evenly. "Market's open to everyone, but it's not a place for trouble." The man chuckled. "That's so. Funny thing is, trouble seems to find certain people, no matter where they go." His gaze slid to Clara, lingering just a second too long. "Especially folks who don't like to share who they are." Daniel stiffened. "You got business with us?" "Maybe," the man replied. "Maybe with her." Clara's fingers curled around the strap of her satchel. She had known this day might come. No matter how carefully she moved, the past had a way of catching up. Still, she hadn't expected it. Here at the one place she felt almost safe. "We don't know you," she said calmly. The man tilted his head. "I know you well enough." Daniel stepped closer, his shoulder brushing hers. The contact steadied them both. "If you're looking for someone," he said, "you've made a mistake." The leader's smile faded. "See, that's where you're wrong. Mistakes don't keep running. People do." The air grew heavy. Somewhere behind them, a horse stamped and snorted, sensing the tension. Clara's mind raced. She could run, but not without drawing attention, and not without leaving Daniel behind. The thought tightened her chest. "Daniel," she whispered, low enough only he could hear. "If this goes bad, don't follow me." He didn't look at her. "Not happening." One of the men reached out, as if to grab her arm. Daniel moved without thinking. His hand snapped up, catching the man's wrist and twisting hard. There was a sharp cry and the unmistakable crack of bone. The crowd gasped. That was all it took. Chaos erupted. Someone shouted, a gunshot rang out, splintering the side of a nearby wagon. Daniel pulled Clara down behind the cover of stacked crates as another shot tore through the air. He drew his revolver, firing once not to kill, but to warn. The men scattered, cursing, scrambling for better positions. "Can you run?" Daniel asked. "Yes," Clara said, though her legs trembled. "Then, when I say go, you don't stop." They waited, breaths shallow, counting heartbeats between shots. When a wagon lurched forward as its owner fled, Daniel seized the moment. Now, they bolted, weaving through panicked traders and spooked animals. Clara's skirts tangled around her legs, but she didn't slow. Daniel stayed just behind her, watching every shadow, every movement. A bullet struck the ground inches from his boot. They reached the far edge of the market and didn't stop until the crossroads was a distant blur behind them. At the shelter of a shallow ravine, they finally paused. Clara bent over, hands on her knees, trying to breathe. Daniel kept watch, revolver still raised. "They weren't random," he said quietly. "No," Clara admitted. "They never are." For the first time since they'd met, the truth pressed hard between them, names, pasts, and dangers no longer content to stay silent. "We can't go back," Daniel said. Clara straightened, meeting his eyes. Then we go forward, together. And in that moment, the rule that had kept them safe began to crumble. They didn't stop until the land opened into a stretch of low hills, scattered with juniper and scrub oak. By then, the sun had begun its slow descent, staining the sky with copper and gold. Daniel finally reined in, listening for pursuit. The only sounds were wind through dry grass and the labored breathing of two people who had run out of places to hide. Clara sank onto a flat rock, pressing a hand to her chest. "They won't follow this far," she said, though it sounded more like hope than certainty. Daniel nodded, but he didn't relax. He scanned the ridgeline, memorizing shadows. Men like that don't rush. They circle. That makes them dangerous. Clara studied him, then really looked at him. She had always known there was more beneath his quiet ways. Now, she saw it, in the way he held his weapon, in the calm that hadn't left his eyes, even when bullets flew. "You've done this before," she said. "Yes," he answered simply. The silence that followed felt heavier than the gunfire had. Clara brushed dust from her skirt, her hands shaking now that the danger had paused. "They were looking for me," she said at last. "Not you." Daniel finally turned to face her. "Why?" She took a slow breath. This was the moment she had avoided for months. "Because I didn't always live by trading bread and candles." He waited, patient as ever. "I was married once," she continued. "To a man who ran guns through 3 territories. I didn't know at first. By the time I did, leaving wasn't simple." Her jaw tightened. "When the law came down on him, I vanished before his enemies decided I was part of the debt." Daniel absorbed this, without judgment. "And now they think you know something." "I do," she said softly. "And that makes me valuable or disposable." She looked up at him then, eyes searching. "Your turn." Daniel exhaled. "I was a deputy, border town. Tried to play honest in a place that didn't reward it." His mouth twisted into a faint, humorless smile. "When I refused a bribe, a man died who wasn't supposed to. The badge didn't protect me after that." "So you ran." "I survived," he corrected. The truth settled between them, oddly grounding. Names no longer felt dangerous, only necessary. "Daniel," she said again, this time with intention. Clara, saying it aloud, felt like crossing a line neither could retreat from. As dusk crept in, they built a small fire tucked between rocks, its light carefully hidden. Clara passed Daniel a piece of bread. He accepted it with a nod, the simplest gestures suddenly carrying weight. "What now?" she asked. "We keep moving," Daniel said. "There's an old trail east, hard to follow, but safer. And after that," he met her gaze, "after that, we stop running, just long enough to choose where we're going." Clara stared into the fire, thinking of the crossroads of the months spent pretending anonymity could be a shield. She realized something then. Knowing his name didn't make her weaker. It made her steadier. In the distance, a coyote howled a lonely sound, but not without purpose. For the first time, Clara felt the pull of something like hope, fragile but real, carried forward on the quiet promise they'd finally dared to speak. They broke camp before dawn, stamping out the last embers and scattering ash the way Daniel had learned years ago, nothing that invited questions. The sky was pale and cold, the kind of morning that made every sound feel louder than it should. Clara wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders as they set out east along the faint trail Daniel had mentioned. Barely more than a suggestion in the grass. By mid-morning, the land grew rougher. Shallow gullies cut the earth, and mesquite thorns snagged at Clara's skirt. Daniel slowed their pace without being asked, offering his hand when the ground dipped steeply. Each small kindness felt deliberate, as if both of them understood that survival now depended as much on trust as skill. "They'll expect us to keep running fast," Daniel said quietly. "Fear makes people predictable." Clara nodded. "Then we do the opposite." They left the trail near a cluster of weathered cottonwoods and turned south, moving toward a dry creek bed that twisted like a scar across the plain. Daniel showed her how to walk on stones instead of soil, how to brush away marks with a low branch. She learned quickly, too quickly for someone who'd lived a simple life, and Daniel noticed. "You adapt fast," he said. She gave a thin smile. "You don't live long if you don't." Near noon, they heard hoofbeat. Daniel froze, pulling Clara down behind a rocky rise. The sound came and went, distant but deliberate. Someone was searching slowly, methodically. "They're closer than I hoped," Daniel murmured. Clara's stomach tightened. "If they catch up, they won't," he said, though his eyes stayed sharp. They waited until the sound faded, then moved again, cutting through brush and rock until the sun hung low and red. By evening, they reached an abandoned line, shack half collapsed against a hill. Daniel inspected it carefully before waving Clara inside. The shack smelled of dust and old wood, but the walls still stood. Clara sank onto a crate, exhaustion finally catching up with her. Daniel barred the door and checked the narrow window, then sat across from her, resting his forearms on his knees. "I don't regret knowing your name," Clara said suddenly. He looked up. "Neither do I." She hesitated. "If we make it through this, I don't want to go back to being no one." Daniel considered that. "I don't think we can. Not anymore." Outside, the wind rose, rattling the loose boards. Clara closed her eyes, memories surfacing, faces she'd tried to forget, promises that had turned sharp. Daniel watched her, wishing he could pull those thoughts from her mind the way he'd pulled her from danger. A faint sound broke the stillness. Voices, not close, but not far. Daniel rose silently, pressing his ear to the wall. "They're splitting up," he whispered, "trying to flush us." Clara stood, heart pounding. "Then we don't stay." They slipped out the back as darkness settled, circling wide and low. Daniel led them into a stretch of badlands where shadows swallowed sound. When they finally stopped, stars blanketed the sky, bright and indifferent. Clara looked up, breath-catching. "It's strange," she said. "Even now, I feel more alive than I did at that market." Daniel met her gaze. Danger has a way of clarifying things. She stepped closer, close enough that he could feel her warmth. "If we survive tomorrow," when he corrected, gently. When she agreed, "I want a life that doesn't depend on running." Daniel didn't answer right away. Then he nodded once. "Then we survive tomorrow." In the darkness, with enemies still hunting and the future uncertain, the promise felt reckless and necessary. They reached the ridge just after dawn. Below them stretched a narrow valley cut by a shallow river, its water glinting silver in the early light. Smoke curled from a small homestead near the bend, desolated, but alive. Daniel studied the land carefully, reading it the way others read books. "This is it," he said. "If they follow, they'll have to come through open ground." Clara nodded, her hands steady despite the weight of everything behind them. She no longer felt like someone being chased. She felt like someone choosing where to stand. They descended slowly, keeping to cover. Halfway down the slope, the sound of hooves broke the morning calm. Daniel turned sharply. "3, maybe 4. They won't stop," Clara said. "No," he agreed. "So we do." They reached a cluster of rocks overlooking the narrowest part of the valley. Daniel checked his revolver, then looked at Clara. "You don't have to stay." She met his eyes without hesitation. I already chose. The riders appeared moments later, spreading out exactly as Daniel predicted. The leader from the Crossroads rode at the front, his confidence dimmed by irritation. "Clara," he called, "you're tired. Come out, and we'll talk." She stepped forward, before Daniel could stop her. "There's nothing left to talk about." The man sneered. "You owe men who don't forget debts." Daniel, fired first not to kill, but to disarm. The shot rang sharp and true. Chaos followed. The valley echoed with gunfire and shouted curses. Daniel moved with practiced precision, forcing the men into the open where they had no cover. Clara stayed low, heart pounding, but when one rider broke through too close, she picked up a fallen rifle and fired. The man fell. Silence followed, heavy and sudden. 2 riders fled. One lay wounded. The leader stared at them, hatred burning in his eyes, before turning his horse and disappearing into the valley's far edge. Daniel stood, breathing hard, then slowly lowered his weapon. Clara's hands trembled as the weight of it all crashed over her. She laughed once short, disbelieving, then sank to her knees. "We're alive," she said. Daniel crossed the distance and pulled her into his arms without thinking. She clutched his coat, grounding herself in the solid proof of him. "Yes," he said softly, "we are." They stayed like that for a long moment, the wind carrying away the last echoes of danger. Later, they approached the homestead together. The owner, a gray-haired woman with sharp eyes, listened to their story without interruption. When they finished, she nodded. "Plenty of work here," she said, "and room for people who don't ask too many questions." Clara glanced at Daniel. This time, there was no fear in the look, only certainty. As the sun climbed higher, the Crossroads felt like another lifetime. No more monthly meetings. No more borrowed safety. Daniel took Clara's hand as they walked toward the house. "Funny thing," he said. "We spent all that time hiding our names. And now," she asked, "now I don't want a life where no one knows who I am." Clara squeezed his hand. "Neither do I." At the place where danger had finally forced the truth, they found something stronger than anonymity, choice, trust, and a future they would build openly, step by step. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more Western stories.